we've got the tough time slot here because you've been listening to very in-depth talks all day, and now you are, hopefully the little caffeine boost from tea will help. This panel is being supported by the Online News Association, who ran a very similar panel, in fact with two of the same members, at their conference last year in Los Angeles. And I think it's safe to say that it opened a lot of eyes to issues that were not getting the attention that they needed. And hopefully today we're going to talk about some of those same issues and build upon that. This is a sensitive subject that we're going to be discussing, so there might be words used or things covered that might be difficult for some people or upsetting, and if you are upset at any point and need to leave, that is absolutely okay. I would like to then introduce our panelists. Starting closest to me is Dr. Michelle Ferrier, an Associate Dean of Innovation at the Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University, an Associate Professor in the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism. She is Vice President of Journalism That Matters and creator of the Create or Die Startup Weekends. And Michelle is also founder of Trollbusters, and she is going to be talking about that very soon. Sydette is the community lead for the Coral Project, building open source tools for better communities around journalism. She's worked in communities around reproductive justice and womanist theatre, technology, and feminism. Soraya Chemaly is the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project and organizer of the Safety and Free Speech Coalition, both of which are involved in raising public awareness about issues related to online abuse, media and tech diversity, and women's freedom of expression. And finally, Becky Gardiner is senior lecturer in journalism at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's worked as a journalist for 25 years and was comment editor of The Guardian until 2014. This year, she's worked as a consultant for The Guardian, looking at the issue of online abuse. She edited the Web We Want series for The Guardian. And we're going to start with, each panelist is going to present a few thoughts on a specific topic, and we're going to start with Michelle.
I hope you can hear me. My name is Michelle Ferrier, and as Fergus already said, I'm founder of Trollbusters, a just-in-time rescue service for women writers and women journalists. I also have been a practitioner working in online communities since before the World Wide Web, so I don't want to tell you how long ago that was, and have been looking at the issue of civility online for quite a bit. And so in the work that we do with Trollbusters, let me go ahead and set the slideshow on this for you. There we go. So the work that we do with Trollbusters is to really move journalists from being the story to being able to do their work and tell the story. As we looked at what's happened in the online space, especially as journalists are being called more and more to engage with their audiences through social media, we find that there's a growing problem with the type of violence against journalists. Recent report by the International News Safety Institute indicated that 88% of journalists believe their work is more violent than it has been in the past, and has increased over the past 10 years. And particularly local journalists are at risk. Not only are they operating within their community, but they're often more visible than somebody that's just online that you don't see at your local grocery store or around town. And so this survey really looked at how people agree or disagree with media workers and this as targets of violence, and believe that it has increased over the past several years. It's because their content is retweeted or shared on social media, it exposes and then opens them up to additional audiences that may take umbrage with that content. In particular, women journalists are targeted online. So we see women journalists, women of color, particularly targeted online because the unique perspective that they bring to the media. They tend to be more vulnerable online to these types of attacks. So Trollbusters started about a year ago It was designed primarily to focus on women news publishers, those that were developing their own online news sites, hyperlocal online sites, etc., to be able to help them stay online and persist online in the face of these online attacks by trolls. Our goal is to offer a SOS team, so provide some just-in-time counter-speech, counter-narrative efforts to be able to address the target and not the troll. So our efforts do not talk directly to the trolls at all. Our goal is to support the target and let them know that they're there. So we do that but by providing a hedge of protection around those targets through positive messaging. We also use technologies to try and find out where trolls are operating to then find the targets of those trolls. So besides the direct reports that we might get from people about what's happening, we also use technology to find trolls and then find the people that they're targeting and offer our services to them. And in addition, beyond the positive messaging that we allow for folks to be able to get through us, we also provide technical support, legal support, referrals to legal entities that might be able to help should these targets choose to go towards prosecution. So our goal really is to fight hate with love. And the idea behind Trollbusters came from my own experiences as an African-American columnist at a newspaper in Florida. This was over 10 years ago. When I wrote a column, I was the first African-American columnist, and I received hate mail through the traditional mail system. And through that experience of receiving hate mail from various people, but one person in particular, over 3 years, I realized that this hate mail was not a one-off kind of thing, but was an organized activity by hate groups in order to be able to silence the voices of women and women of color online specifically. The tactic was to use fear and intimidation to be able to shut down our voices online. So some of the positive messaging, we use funny things, we use inspirational quotes, we use other things that will actually smile. The idea is not only will the content itself make you laugh or put a smile on your face, but through sending persistent and consistent messages into the Twitter stream, we also dilute the messages of the trolls themselves so they're not as visible. We use other different types of campaigns and memes and text messages as well to help support these targets online. We also attempt to help the target help themselves by providing them with tips online along with these messages to help them keep that online activity online and not migrating to offline spaces by sharing with them how they can protect their identity online, how they can protect their location, how they can safely surf the web without disclosing their location, and other tips that they can use to mitigate the damage of troll activity while it's actually happening. So that's our introduction to Trollbusters, and I'll have a chance to allow you different questions later on.
Thank you. Sydette.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. I'm going to try and keep myself to 5 minutes. What I would like to do today is slightly shift the conversation. What kind of communities do you want to have? Who are the members of those communities? And how are you demonstrating that you are accountable to those communities? What is important to me as a community lead is different than what is important to me as a commenter, is different than what is important to me as a social media user. As a community lead of the Coral Project, it is a partnership between the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Mozilla Corporation, funded by a Knight grant. We are building open source tools dedicated to helping people build communities around news. Right now our tools are Trust, Ask, and Talk. Trust is going to give you information about your community. Ask will allow you to solicit feedback and user-generated content. And Talk is about having ways for you to talk to your community. These are great tools, they are wonderful, but they do not exist in a vacuum. One of the things that is constant about discussions about harassment, specifically of women online, is we want to get rid of the trolls. We want to get rid of harassment. The question that people find harder to answer is, what do they want after? What will your community be after you've gotten rid of the trolls? This is important to me because I think we have to rethink what trolling is and is not, who is and is not a troll, and what that means. Everyone can be a troll. Catherine Cross who is a PhD student in this, has said that trolling often is certain kinds of behavior. If we continually talk about trolls as something that is off there, off in the distance, we miss the opportunity to look at the aspects of online interaction and trolling that reflect our own behavior. When do we tip over from merely being heated into being dangerous? That line is often much closer than we think it is. And depending on what our communities look like is often defended, depending on who that person is. When we talk about online harassment, when we talk about all these things, it becomes important for us to define what the fight is for, not just against. If you believe that your readers are worthy, if you believe that the people who can add to your news are worthy, then we have to think about ways that we have set up introducing them into the news space. It is very simple to say that we kind of just had a thing and we didn't do the thing and we just have space there. But every action, even no action, is a way you have defined your community. If you never had moderators, you've defined your community. If someone is allowed to interject or call someone stupid, you've defined your community. If you have someone who corrects someone's grammar, even if they are telling a deeply personal story, you have defined your community. Whether or not you intended to, or whether or not you know what the consequences of that decision are, is up to you, is up to your history. But as we work towards redefining and dealing with online harassment, my biggest concern is that the vacuum left behind after we do all of these measures will still leave us with communities that reflect some of our worst impulses: racism, sexism, classism, transphobia. Because in looking at how do we get rid of our worst actors, we've treated it as a problem of tone and degree rather than system and action.
Thank you. We're gonna please hold your questions for the time being, because I think once we have heard from everyone, we will have a really nice scene set for debate.
Okay.
Soraya.
So I have just one slide. I don't know if you want.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to. Thank you. So I started writing in the 90s and then went into the corporate world in media, going from being a journalist to being on the business side, strategic planning and development, and ended up at a company that pioneered what we think of now as big data. And that experience combined was an interesting one to have when I went back to writing full-time in 2011. When I started writing in 2011, I was writing specifically as a feminist, often about sexual violence, but sometimes about gender and education, or any topical issues in which gender, race, sexuality became salient. And when that happened, almost immediately, I started getting threats, really depending on what the person targeting me thought about my identity. A lot of people think I'm Muslim, and in that case, they, for example, will use Islamophobic threats. And so as I started to write about this and talk to other writers, I realized how normalized this was in our day-to-day lives and the costs associated to doing this work. But the other thing that happened was that out of the woodwork, people started to send me their stories. And some of them were incredibly violent, incredibly dangerous situations. And so I started working with technology companies to say, hey, what's going on? You have guidelines for behavior. You have communities that you're trying to shape. Why are these interactions not registering through your moderation process? And it was quite evident at that point, to Sydette's point about systems, that we had overlapping systems in which societal tolerance for certain types of inequities and violence were amplifying this effect online. And in 2013, I launched, along with Jacqueline Friedman, who was the head of something called Women Action in the Media, and with Laura Bates, who started Everyday Sexism, a campaign demanding that Facebook recognize misogyny on its platform. Now, what was happening was that they had guidelines about abuse, harassment, violence, racism, anti-religious sentiment, homophobia, and they even had guidelines about discrimination on the basis of gender. But when those things intersected, they weren't recognizing that. So they might recognize anti-Semitism, but if it happened to be a Jewish woman who was getting the kind of abuse that she would uniquely get as a woman who was Jewish, it just seemed not to register. So at the time, for example, on that platform, there were pages with names like I Kill Bitches. There were a lot of non-consensual pornography pages advocating rape. And women journalists and women politicians tend to be the ones that are most likely to be targeted for this kind of violence, and then to find themselves on Facebook pages, for example, or the targets of mob attacks on Twitter. So after talking about this for a few years, last February, I launched a project with the Women's Media Center that brought together the issues of diversity in media overall, which is related to the problems that we're seeing, the lack of diversity in media, and the effects of online harassment. This diagram is meant to really define what we talk about when we use the fairly anodyne term online harassment. It's very specific, and it asks people to be specific with their language. So the first thing we wanted to look at were what are the most common tactics? Impersonation, we've heard about today, doxing, which is sharing people's information, certainly rape and death threats against people who write about certain topics, reproductive health, feminism, sexual violence. Those tend to cause some of the most, to produce some of the most violent interactions. And so the tactics may be, some of them illegal. So we have another circle that shows issues of legality in the United States. You can't really produce a wheel like this globally. But the thing about the tactics is that they may be illegal, but they may not contravene platform policies. In other cases, they do, but they're not illegal. And then you add to that the fact that people are being harassed across platforms in very organized ways. So as Michelle said, these are not casual interactions. Very, very often, what's happening is organized groups will follow a person from platform to platform in order to denigrate them, intimidate them, harass them, threaten them. And then the third circle is just, we really need to understand what the overall costs are, the personal costs, the financial costs, the cost of people's professional lives, and to understand this not from the perspective of victimization, but of real civil rights issues, particularly when it comes to women journalists who are engaged in the political sphere, in the civic sphere, and who are unable to freely express themselves in equal measure. So we're working with legislators, with technology companies, as part of a larger coalition that is global. There are 19 or 20 organizations now that are part of this coalition. We work a lot with women in high-risk areas like Pakistan, various parts of India, Afghanistan. There are groups in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, South America, many flashpoints in South America right now for this kind of online harassment of women. And we hope to both raise public awareness, but also be able to work on challenging the kinds of institutional norms that come from our ideas of what traditionally represented neutrality and objectivity. So in our dealings with companies, where we range from talking about tactical things like your report button is insufficient, we hope to go from there to talk about policies, how they are defined, and the types of cultural norms that are established by very small groups of homogenous people. So that's the work that we're doing at the Speech Project.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, okay. I've just talked briefly about the work I've been doing at The Guardian. I was comment editor at The Guardian or for Americans here, opinion editor at The Guardian for about 4 years before I left about 18 months ago. So I'd had a lot of experience of commissioning opinion articles, which then had a lot of response below the line. So I'd been a kind of observer, really, of the Guardian community below the line and how it operated for some years. When Catherine Viner was made editor-in-chief of The Guardian, she felt as the first woman editor, she really wanted to tackle what was becoming more obviously an important issue, which was of the online abuse of women journalists. So she asked me back to do a bit of research for her, and a series which sat within a series of pieces looking at the issue more broadly. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about the research that we did. So what we did is we realised that The Guardian had an amazing source of data on this. They had 70 million comments that had been left below articles since articles were open to comments in 2006. There was a lot of data attached to those comments, not least whose article they were written under and any moderation action that had been taken on those comments and what subject the article was about. So we just looked at that, really, and what we looked at in particular was the relationship between the proportion of blocked comments that an article received and the gender of the writer. So that was our sort of question, really. What we found, first of all, was when we sorted our articles by gender, we found that, like all mainstream news organisation, about 2/3 of the articles on the Guardian site during that period had been written by men and only 1/3 by women. So women were in quite a significant minority of writers. So it was a male-dominated space. We found that gender imbalance was more pronounced in some sections than others. This won't come as any surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, but in sport, for example, the gender imbalance was very pronounced. In life and style, much less so. So already it was raising quite interesting questions about the environment in which women journalists operate, which have nothing to do with the communities which then respond to the journalism they do. We then found that the more male-dominated the section, the more blocked comments that articles written by women attracted. So there were fewer women writing in sport, but those women who did write in sport attracted a greater proportion of blocked comments than the men writing in sport. We found that some subjects attracted more blocked comments than others, and that some of those were obvious, like Israel-Palestine, for example. Some perhaps also possibly obvious, like feminism. Some much less obvious, in my view, like the gender pay gap, which I would have thought was fairly uncontroversial. In fact, was right up there with Israel-Palestine, practically. And we found that in those sensitive subjects, which were gender neutral, like Israel-Palestine, for example, still women who wrote about those things got more block comments than men. And in subjects that weren't sensitive, like rugby, for example, which actually gets a very low proportion of block comments, women still got more block comments than men. So it really was overall, consistently, regardless of what they were writing about or where they were writing, articles written by women got more block comments than those written by men. It was quite a stark finding. But there was one finding that really captured people's imagination, I think, and I suspect is why the piece of work we did got a lot of publicity and attention. And that was, we looked at the people who wrote regularly for our opinion section, which was Commented Free, now renamed Opinion, but it was Commented Free for a long time. So we looked at people who had written at least 100 articles for Commented Free. So they were regular writers of opinion pieces. And we looked at who of those writers got the most block comments, highest proportion of block comments. And you sort of couldn't have made it up, really. We have found that of the top 10 regular writers who got the most block comments on the site, 8 were women, and 4 of those women were non-white, and there were 2 men, both of whom were black. If you broke down those 10 in slightly different ways, we found that 2 of the women and 1 of the men were gay, that 1 of the women was Muslim, 1 of the women was Jewish. I mean, it was like, and when you then looked at the 10 regular writers who got the least block comments, they were all men. So it was quite a sort of stark and finding which very much tallied with what individual women had been saying and observing for many years. So it was very interesting. Before I go on to say more about that, I just want to very quickly say how we presented the findings was not only was it given a very beautiful interactive graphic treatment by the data visualization team at The Guardian, which was very beautiful. So if you haven't seen it, please do look at it. But also we included videos of some of those people, 2 women, 1 man, who were in the top 10, talking about how it felt to receive that much sort of negative attention for what they wrote. So it was within, the numbers were given within the context of the experience and how journalists experienced it. We also very deliberately tried to engage our community in this discussion. So we included a quiz, a moderation quiz, where we asked readers to moderate 10 comments, all kind of based on real comments and real moderation decisions. And we deliberately chose several of those were not straightforward. They weren't easy decisions to make, and that was deliberate. It was showing that moderation is a human function. It's a subjective act and a political act, really, what you choose to allow on the site and what you don't. And did people feel we were making those decisions in the right place? We were interested in our readers' feedback. And the other thing that we did was we included a form where we asked readers to write to us and say what their experience of commenting had been, what they would like to see change. So there was a real and meant attempt to engage readers in trying to improve this situation. And we've had nearly 2,000 readers took the trouble to fill in that form. It was quite a long form, asking a lot of detailed questions, so that was a very impressive response. And we're at the moment going through those and we're going to publish something sort of representing those views. I think the research was significant in 3 ways. First of all, the findings themselves. There'd been a lot of anecdotal evidence and a lot of survey evidence, but there'd been very little look at the actual data in that way. And so I think that having that sort of harder evidence of something that had been observed for a long time, I think is a useful contribution. I'd like to see more of that. Second, the process. I think opening up that conversation with readers and in the context of making a clear statement that The Guardian does not intend to turn its comments off. It values its community for all sorts of reasons and wants to make that community better. I think that was a very positive move. Internally, lots of work is being done at The Guardian in improving the commenting platform on responding to the things that have been raised in various different ways and thinking about how to support staff better. And thirdly, I think it was significant because it was a very brave step by Catherine Viner, I think, to allow that data to be used to make a commitment that we would publish whatever we found, which we did. And I very, very much hope that someone will follow The Guardian's lead in that and that more platforms and those with much bigger communities will start being more transparent about this kind of this kind of data. I think it would be extremely useful. And I really don't see how there are going to be any kind of solutions without that kind of evidence. So that's it.
I'd like this to be a discussion rather than just me asking questions, but I would just like to kick off by building on what Becky said and throw something to Sydette, actually, which is, The Guardian chose to keep their comments going because the value was there. But some people turn off their comments because of abuse and harassment. You are involved in a project that is potentially redefining commenting, and I just wondered what your view on this was. Why do we keep comments open?
I think those are 2 separate ideas. You keep comments open because you are interested in what your community has to say and you're willing to dedicate the resources to make that a good place for them to say them. If you are not willing to do that thing, please close your comments. It always gets a little bit of a chuckle because I work for something that works on comments, but if you are not going to actually actively moderate or phrase your comments in a way that is acceptable to you, close them. If your site doesn't care, willy-nilly, everybody gets some, leave them open. But far too often, people close their comments and then do not open up another way for their readers to interact with them. And they say things like, oh, we'll do it on Facebook, we'll do it on Twitter. And that, I think, is both ethically unsound, and I think it is also not a good business model. Twitter and Facebook don't care about your brand. Twitter and Facebook, in many ways, are looking to be your competition. But you are outsourcing the discussion of your content to these places that in many ways will now repackage that and sell and put it on their own site. So reactions to articles are now parts of Twitter moments. Reactions to articles are now Facebook streams. They're trending topics on Facebooks, and they're not on your site. And I think that there are multiple reasons that they are not on news sites that actually have a really kind of long history. But those are things that should be part of your content because you work to make that content. Writers and editors work to make that content. But they also reflect the way comments and often letters to the editor have been, where there is this beautiful, Greg Barber, our projects, we will talk about it, that you have above the line, crafted journalism, dedicated, time was invested, then the line hits after share this, do this, and there's a white box. Go ahead, do what you want. And that stark contrast affects the way people look at your stuff, affects the way people look at your journalism. And I think that's a huge problem. If you do not want to do that work, if that's not part of your consideration, do not have comments. Because the other side about it is that it is patently unfair to the people who do come to your comments to have discussions, to be in a space where people can get away with anything and you're not even looking at it. And it is really unfair for what has often happened among professionals, and this is disturbing to me, where people go, well, that's what you get for being in comments. What? Someone cares enough to talk to you, and it's a horrible space, and the response is, well, you should know by now that this is abusive. That's not fair. And then more importantly, that's not the way you invest in your future readers. The flip side of that also being is how we take content from comments, from social, from Facebook, from Twitter, is also a thing we're going to have to talk about. Because the model of how we will build content and exchange news is becoming much more community-based, multiple author, not just broadcast, but nodal. So we are talking to multiple people, and we have to start developing an ethic and business model for that. And people think often when we talk about the Coral Project that we are just yay comments. Because, well, yes, yay comments. I love comments, read comments. I would love all of you to have comments. But we are also asking for people to make serious thoughts about the communities, informational and otherwise, you are building around your journalism.
Soraya, you've worked extensively with social networks on this issue. I just want commenting spaces are one thing, but as Sydette says, this is the shift to social platforms is not any better.
No, I'd say it's a force amplifier, right? Because if you take what Becky's found in the comment sections of The Guardian, the demographics of The Guardian are pretty standard across the industry. So 64% of bylines are men. A percentage of those are men of color, but as far as gender and race are concerned, it really hasn't changed since roughly 1992. We've been stagnant since 1992. And so the dynamics that were amply on display in this analysis, I would say could fairly easily be extrapolated to most other platforms that are similar. But when you open your comments and content up on social media platforms, you are then engaging people who are not in your own community to begin with, and you're opening up yourselves as writers or as editors to a much bigger spectrum that possibly is engaged in a much wider spectrum of tactics of abuse. And as far as being journalists, what I find most disturbing is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of emphasis on understanding the dissolution between public and private. And by that I mean, if you are a woman in particular, you are already being subject to all kinds of violence, surveillance. You may not even register it, right? But if you just think about the way that we adapt to avoiding rape, we just incorporate it into our lives. We don't do certain things. We don't exercise certain places. We don't take certain jobs. We don't walk certain places. It's just part of the way that we live. But when you start getting racist, homophobic, corrective rape threats online, you have to pay attention to those things. And that might not happen in the comments on The Guardian because someone's moderating that, but it is certainly going to happen in Twitter and in Facebook. And institutions need to be aware of what the impact of that is on their writers' ability to do their work. And I think Michelle really touches on this because it is a serious impediment. I know many, many, many people who have chosen to stop writing about topics that are near and dear to them, that they have expertise in. They stop writing on certain platforms. They stop engaging. They use pseudonyms. They lose huge investments in their own identities and professional lives. And those are all considerations that institutions need to take into account, particularly, I think, when they do understand that they want to be more representative. But one of the things that's happening right now is a lot of media companies will try and broaden the range of their writers, which means that they're inviting a lot of people whose voices were marginal before into spaces where the dominant commenters belong to an earlier community, which means they are probably going to be predisposed to being more hostile to these voices. But what often happens is that if you are a young person, if you, for example, are a Muslim woman, you are often asked not to write about economic policy, but something having to do with your identity. Your identity becomes very salient to what you're writing, but it also means that your exposure is higher. And so the act of trying to diversify the pool of journalists is also implicated, particularly if there's no institutional response, in the levels of abuse that someone can experience.
I just want to add one quick thing because I think that this is really important to also look at, but how newspapers use content from social media and Twitter and Facebook is often just as damaging,
Right.
and it's treated like the public sphere. And I've separate from this as a person who is semi-famous on Twitter, I've often had a lot of people go, well, you're in the public. What I'm willing to say to 2,000 people who I've kind of been following around the internet for about 10 years is very different than what happens if I pop open a BuzzFeed article or pop open an Inc.com article and suddenly see myself everywhere. And there's a really good article called "What Happens When Your Tweet Goes Viral." It was on Medium. It's by Jamie Nesbitt Golden and Monique Judge, and that is just as much a part of this discussion around the ethic as I think anything else. Because too often, what I worry about in harassment is that it becomes, we are worried about this for certain people. We're worried about it when it's journalists. We're not worried about it when it's women. We're worried about it when it's people of a certain follower count. We're not worried about it when it's an activist. But we are continually, as a journalistic system, trying to build a broader base. And if we are bringing people to this broader base, they are dealing with the dangers of our broader base. But because it's social and we took it from social, but we don't have comments, what happens to them on social, not our problem.
Right.
Michelle, you were about to say something.
I got the point, so we'll move on.
I think you raise an interesting point about consent here, and how consent seems to be a lot more fluid a concept than previously in the way that we treat content, but the way that we treat people. You know, I'm by writing something, I'm not giving you consent to harass me. I am not, by posting something, I'm not giving you consent to take my content and use it in a way that is out of context, or even about giving informed consent. And I just wonder if there, and I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, Michelle, about someone picked up a pen, wrote a letter, and put it in the post. And now the technology to be able to communicate in that way is a lot easier to do. And is that why it's more prevalent now, or is it easier?
I think anonymity feeds into it, in particular on the social media, where you can respawn identities by the minute. And create new ways of being able to attack people. Back when I was building online communities, we really did initially at least invest in strong moderation. And that was something that was really important, setting it out in your terms of service, putting technological solutions in so that the crowd can flag objectionable comment. Not that it was left as a wild, wild west of dialogue. And I think we've really abdicated that space as media folks and really not thought about how we'd like to use that space and what we intend our audience to get out of it, and then be explicit about how we as media organizations are then going to use that content. Some of the things that I looked at when I was building online communities in the past, and it really startled me. Everybody knows there's terms and conditions that are on these sites. Nobody reads them, right? However, at the point of posting, we didn't offer anything like pull rules, and that's what I called them. You know, these are the things that you should not do on our site, and here are the consequences for those kinds of behaviors. We just abdicated that space instead of controlling it, perhaps by allowing only a certain kinds of responses. Perhaps, I'd like to know more about X, or I have resources that might help X, or another question. So why not constrain those comment spaces in a way that actually perhaps furthers a community action on the issue, allows the reporter to understand perhaps what was incomplete in the article and how to go about doing a follow-up article that might help inform more people, and be able to actually use that comment section as a dialogic space that actually leads to action or sharing or some other kind of beneficial community behavior, rather than this is my opinion and take it or leave it.
Becky, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that one of the things that happened was, I remember when comments were opened on The Guardian, and nobody anticipated, I think, the huge appetite there would be for commenting, and it grew so fast. I mean, even in the last, this is it might be a slightly misremembered figure, but it's something like in the last year it grew from 40,000 comments a day to 65,000 comments a day, just in a year. So there's this massive scaling up. And so The Guardian has always had moderation, and it's always taken that very seriously, but you can't continually scale up your moderation. So I think where The Guardian is getting to now, I think, is looking much more at what kind of engagement do we want, and different kinds of engagement under different kinds of pieces. And they've already taken a few kind of emergency measures, really, which are some threads where, like on migration, for example, where you might have 6 stories open on that subject on one day. We know it's a very difficult subject for there to be a civil conversation about it. So instead of opening 6 threads, we'll just open 1. I mean, that seems obvious now, but that's quite a recent development. So I think there are, we've also started trying to look at different ways that writers can engage below the line with readers. So, because we know that readers like that, and we know it helps the conversation, but it can be a very bruising experience for writers. So we've started doing things like opening up a comment thread for just 1 hour with a writer there for 1 hour, so that it's not this endless thing. I mean, I know for myself, under the research that we did, there were 2,000 comments within the first sort of 8 hours or something. I was in there desperately trying to answer as many as I could, and yet endlessly people are saying, oh, I see there's nobody in here from The Guardian answering any of these criticisms. And you're like, I've been here all day. I've just like been here all day. So, we need to be realistic about what we can do, and I think we're learning,
I think it feels like we've painted quite a bleak picture, but is it as bleak as it sounds sometimes, or are there things that can be done right now by individuals?
On that actually, which is that I'm actually a huge advocate of comments, as Sydette obviously is as well. But I'd watched so many brilliant threads unfold below the line when I was comment editor. Really, just such enjoyable conversations, funny things, really informative conversations, really combative but interesting debates. I genuinely think there's an awful lot good out there. And in the research that we did, it was only 2% of the comments were blocked, so of those 70 million. So it's not like it's an epidemic of abuse. But we are at a point where we need to do something about the abuse that is there, I think.
There were so many good ideas that we just went through. I think that we need to think of the comment sections as part of this larger ecology, right? I mean, if you think about a company like Facebook, which is now the world's biggest distributor of news, they field over 1 million comments a day that are being reported. 1 million bits of content are being reported to Facebook. And people think that they're dealing with those algorithmically, but they're not. It's an intensely human endeavor. And the work that it takes to regulate, to moderate these comments is immense. But it's also the regulation of free speech. Every single terms of service, every single moderation guideline, every word that is written about what people should and shouldn't do, can and cannot do, is a form of regulation. And the way large companies are working is as transnational governments across borders. They have a lot of control over what's happening. And so each media entity is a microcosm of what's happening in this much larger realm of how this content moves around. The problem to me as a writer, and I talk to a lot of companies now about how they can create an institutional response that will support their writers, which I will say positively is something that wasn't happening 5 years ago. I mean, you have a story, Michelle, of having a concern and having an editor 10 years ago basically say, well, just have someone walk you to your car if you're worried, right? That is not the way to support a writer. That is not a way to understand what's going on. Today, if Michelle had that job, or for example, in my job, I write a lot about rape. And the response, for example, at a platform like Jezebel is that writers have to moderate their own content. And what that resulted in was that women every day coming in and looking at content that was being bombarded with violent pornographic rape gifs. And eventually, because their parent company wasn't doing anything, they wrote an open letter and said, this is unsustainable, it's intolerable. But the work of moderating this content is incredibly psychologically taxing, and it causes in the people that do it a lot of secondary trauma. So it requires that institutions, if they're going to take this on seriously and be thoughtful about it and understand the role it plays in the larger media environment, it requires an investment of intellect and people and money to do it really well. Otherwise, you end up with some pretty unpleasant, explosive situations that don't really do, they do the community a disservice, and they do the industry a disservice.
Before I open it up to questions, just one last question from me. In terms of practical advice, in terms of what people can do if they feel that they are being harassed, how can they take that to a manager, to someone with the authority who might be able to do something about it in an environment where it's never occurred before and people don't really understand the issues, which I imagine is perhaps more common than not?
I think in the journalism community, there's a culture of not talking about these issues and not expressing them. I think it came out at the ONA Keynote when women in the audience were literally weeping and tweeting as we had our session, trying to understand and process their own threats that they never told anybody about. So there's an incredible culture against people reporting this type of thing, being managers being dismissive, the police being dismissive. And what I'm talking about are the types of tweets that are rape threats, death threats, things that actually could move offline and become activities where somebody is really harmed in meat space, in physical space. And so I think we have to get past that culture of this being a problem for people to report it, first and foremost, and not seeing it as a weakness of women if they complain about these issues, because it's persistent and consistent. And as Soraya says, there's a psychological toll to that kind of persistent behavior over time in wearing down somebody's beliefs. As I began to experience this as a writer, I began to self-select the topics that I would write about in my column. There were certain weeks that I just really wasn't sure what I wanted to say. My column often talked about my children and where they went to school, and so I was very exposed in terms of physical space. People would see me in the supermarket. They saw my face in the newspaper. And so I think we have a very similar dynamic online where it's difficult to hide. Especially when you're a journalist in doing your work online in this space. So I think, one, we need to take these threats seriously. Two, I think the platforms have really abdicated their responsibility. to the public and to the crowds and to the secondary users of these platforms to be the moderators. And I think they should take some of the profits that they're making and put that back into strong moderation. Yes, there'll be a secondary effect of those people having to psychologically deal with that content, but I literally was afraid for my life and my family and quit my job and moved in order to move myself from the implied threat that was coming at me from the work that I did. There's an economic impact to this work. Think about the freelancer who doesn't have a large media organization to be able to support them, to be able to go back online, try and support themselves and get new work when their search engine optimization, if somebody looks up their stuff, comes up with all of this garbage that somebody's put on there, the slander and misinformation. They become toxic and then they can't get work. So there are some long-term effects, and I think some of the things that we need to do, one is awareness, making the public as well as journalism and media organizations more savvy about how this happens and why they need to pay attention to it. We need to do a better job of educating our students who are journalists that are coming up in the dangers of the online environment and how to protect themselves. I was really startled earlier on in our conversations that journalists didn't know how to use PGP. And that should be a basis of our work to be able to not only protect ourselves, but our sources. In the work that we're doing. And we're not training our young people in how to be able to use those types of encryption tools to be able to protect themselves. Secondly, I think putting a third party in between the journalist and the social media. So if a journalist or a broadcaster is experiencing this kind of thing, just letting them step away from the comments, not necessarily closing them off, etc., but they don't have to be the one to personally deal with and respond to these types of comments, allows them to be able to take a little bit of distance from what they're experiencing and perhaps deal with and process what they have to deal with emotionally.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, a few. All over the other side, Rena, sorry. If we can just take a couple of questions at a time, because we've got 5 minutes to answer them. Yep.
This is to Becky and Sydette, to broaden the concept of people who get banned. Around the time, because I think there's an operating principle here, apart from in some of Sydette's comments, that people who post comments that get deleted or get blocked or softest at The Guardian get pre-moderated are either bad people doing bad things or good people who are drunk or offensive or and so on. But I'm interested in around the time that Becky left The Guardian, offguardian.org started up, which is a community, as far as I know, I only see their articles occasionally, so it may in fact be a front for Putin's Russia, for all I know. But it simply seems to be, on the face of it, a group of people who are more than capable of writing very sensible comments, who have a grievance against The Guardian's comment policy, and decided in a citizen activist kind of way to set up an alternative place to discuss the things that they like to discuss. I'd love to know a little bit more about that, because that seems a complexifying, problematizing component to this discussion.
Just get the other two questions, if that's
There's
okay.
a question really for Michelle. You spoke about tracking down the perpetrators, and I wondered what you'd learned about them doing that work.
And one more.
Hi, my question was follow-up because we just alluded that question when we were discussing the quality of comments and the investment it requires. I wanted to know if you had any ideas about how you can monetize the service to make sure you can put up some credits in order to invest in high quality comments.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you if you can be quite concise. Becky, with
if I take the off-Guardian thing, I mean, two points. First of all, the research we did is only as robust as the moderation that we do. That's quite clear. So if moderation decisions are often not good decisions, then that research is not worth an awful lot. How I would defend the research is I believe that moderation decisions are fairly robust, but also I think more significantly, over such a large data set, I think that some mistakes and problems with moderation would probably be ironed out. So I don't think it particularly undermines the finding of the research. The off-Guardian thing is a very interesting thing. I don't know a lot about them. I've seen them myself. They're basically a group of former Guardian readers and commenters who claim that they were accused by moderators of being Putin bots. I mean, it's funny, I almost raised it in the earlier discussion about the Putin bots. It's a very interesting thing. It would be fascinating to go back and look at some of that experience to see whether there was a sort of inbuilt bias at The Guardian on that particular issue. I really can't comment on it. I mean, there might be. You'd have to really look, I think, at what happened. It's certainly a very complicated area, how things are moderated. I mean, I could talk for hours on that, and I think there's all sorts of political biases in that process. The only thing that I would say in the context of this discussion is I think for what we were looking at, which was the difference in how women writers and male writers are treated, I don't think that really comes into it particularly. But I think it's a very interesting area.
For that question specifically, I just would like to bring up the idea of in certain cases, looking at this less as a harassment issue and more as a design issue, and also more as a communal space issue. I am blocked by some of the best people on the internet, and they deserve the right to block me. I can be terrible. But it is their right. And it's not necessary, and there is a lot of moral judgment sometimes when we talk about this of why do you block this people, why is this going on? But if I am in a communal space with someone and we have come to a certain amount of community rules and you don't meet them, you have the option of going somewhere else to form your own community. And in terms of interacting with comments and not interacting with comments, we don't have to see the same internet. It does not necessarily have to be all in together for us to have a useful dialogue. And if someone wants to not see them, one of the things we're looking at is, if you have a comment section, do I have to see everyone's comments? If I allow myself to block this person because I'm uninterested in what they have to say, even if it is not necessarily inflammatory, are there ways we can still hold up conversation? And I think that needs to be part of the discussion. Because with a lot of the design, and Soraya brought this up, is that these actual functions don't work well. Your block button doesn't work well. It's not necessarily that the person is bad or terrible, but your block button doesn't work well. And if I don't want to see you, I shouldn't have to see you. And if you don't want to see me, you shouldn't have to see me.
Michelle, just
Very quickly.
very quickly what you
Very
learned.
quickly.
Yeah.
So what we learned about the trolls. One of the things I think we need to do is nuance this conversation a little bit, because there are different kinds of trolls. There's the one-off troll, the single person operating, has an opinion, wants to get that out. There's also the bots that we heard about earlier that interact with people in social media. What we've been looking at primarily are the smart mobs, those that have legions of humans acting on behalf of those generals who are sending messages out using back channels on Reddit and 4chan and others, instructions on how to deconstruct and take down particular targets. And so these are not the mythology, as I say, of the teen boy in a basement. This is organized hate that is using these kinds of fear and intimidation tactics to specifically target women and women of color online and to shut down those diverse voices. So I think we need to get a lot more nuanced, because these groups are very smart. They are very rhetorically savvy. They know how to break down reports and arguments, and they know how to write up to the letter of the law regardless of what country they're operating in. So they know how to make their veiled threats an implicit threat that's not an explicit threat that's actionable by the police or through legal means. And so we have to become more savvy about how we deal with each of those different types of trolls and putting systems in place to deal with them. You can block, the technologies start to block a troll, but what if hundreds of people are coming at you at once and they're real people? That becomes a taxing activity for somebody to moderate that kind of space if you're a one-person news operation running a hyperlocal news site, or if you're being under a DDoS attack and technologically your site is coming down. Those are ways that they're using to silence the speech of women and women of color online in a very systematic way. So we just need to get more savvy about when we describe trolls, what kinds of trolls are we talking about, and then what kinds of systems can we put in place to deal with those types of activity.
Well, thank you, Michelle, Sydette, Soraya, and Becky.
Thank you.
And I'm sure if you've got a question that you didn't want to ask publicly, I'm sure
The gentleman had one question about monetization.
then we can meet outside because the next session is itching to get on. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.